Please pray with me. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts here gathered always be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. We're focusing on humanity and human nature this morning. And to be frank, I don't think I've ever wrote out so many ideas, written so much, and then just tossed it aside and left it over there. There's just like a ridiculous amount that got left on the cutting room floor. And with all that said, the strange thing is the thing I want to lead with, the first thing I thought of leading with is actually personality type tests, because frankly it's just really what I'm into these days, and Myers-Briggs and that kind of thing. And the fact that I kind of revel in the fact that I'm an INTJ, if you have any idea what that is. For those of you not familiar, that personality usually lines up in various fictional universes with characters like, say, the Emperor in Star Wars and Voldemort in Harry Potter. And I'm probably prouder of that than I should be as a pastor, especially as the whole point of this morning's sermon is that our worth is not found in ourselves, but there it is. What do you do? Anyway, I usually talk about the I in that INTJ. Then the I stands for introvert. That way you understand me better when you see during fellowship I'm hiding in a corner somewhere, okay? But today I want to talk about the second letter, the N. Now there are two possible letters there. You can be an N, which stands for intuitive, or you can be an S, which stands for observant. You're picking up the S there. It didn't like the O, I don't know why, right? Anyway, if you're an N, you lean towards seeing the world as it should be, right? You sort of intuit the world. And if you're an S, you focus on seeing the world as it is, as it looks. In my household, my daughter and I are N's, right? And my wife and son are S's, which means when it's time to go looking for anything, my daughter and I look in the places where we think it should logically be, right? Whereas my wife and son look, well, around and in the places where they've seen it last. So, for instance, my wife will say something like, "Zoe, can you bring me a can of tomato sauce?" And after a few minutes of frustration, my daughter will say, "Where? I can't find it. I looked downstairs in the pantry, I looked in the cabinet, I can't find it anywhere." And my son will be looking at my sister quite bewildered in the kitchen and see it standing right in front of her on the kitchen countertop and says, "Zoe, it's right there." "Where? I don't see it." Right? That's kind of, it's an exaggerated version of the difference, but that's the difference. At the same time, if you were to compare my wife's and my computer's together, right, there are file management systems in the computer. Mine are neat and ordered very logically, at least I think so. I've got everything folders correctly where it's supposed to go. And hers are, well, she can find everything, right? Because she's very observant, right? She remembers where things are, but I can't figure it out for the life of me. But that's really the tension in what it means to understand, well, all of this, right? Life, meaning, the universe, right? What you can see around you and what you believe should logically be. And modernity leans very heavily on the empirical, that is what you can know by seeing, what you can know by observing. The poster child for this is probably the French philosopher Rene Descartes. In 1637, caught up in all the heady excitement of the Enlightenment and all the new scientific thought that was emerging from it, he decided to start philosophy from scratch. And he would doubt everything he knew about everything, about the world, about himself, about everything, and see if there was one thing that he could know for certain and start from there. And so he came to the conclusion that if he was doubting everything, if he was capable of doubting everything, he was clearly thinking. And if he was thinking, he was clearly being, right? He clearly existed, and hence the famous phrase, "I think, therefore I am." It's kind of the flagship statement of modern thought, the idea of the primacy of the observable, what you can see, of the empirical, of the provable. Of course, there have been countless critiques of that statement, right? Because that's what you do in philosophy or theology, right? You just kind of argue forever about everything, really. That's kind of what you do. The Danish philosopher, a Christian, Soren Kierkegaard, thought it was just plain redundant, right? Just saying the word I, he said, presupposes is, right? It's just kind of silly. Why would you even have that statement? Others pointed out there's no way to get beyond that statement, beyond the purely subjective, right? Everything beyond that statement, well, it could be an illusion put in your head by some superpower, or you could just be a computer simulation or something like that. Okay, I exist, but that doesn't mean anything to anything else, right? In other words, very limited, very limiting. More poignantly, 20th century German philosopher Martin Heidegger suggested it wasn't thinking that grounded our existence, but it's the certainty we will die, right? That is what makes being so meaningful. I'm guessing he didn't get invited to a lot of parties, anyway. Scottish philosopher John McMurray has argued that, well, that actually reduces our whole being to the mind, right? It divides the mind and the body because what we are, he thought, is not just or even mostly what we think. It's rather what we do, right? And importantly for him, it's what we do with each other. Because human beings are relational. We don't exist in a vacuum. Not as, we're not that kind, we're not in Descartes' vision there. We exist with each other. And more importantly, together with God. And I want to get back to that point. But here's the thing I want you to take away so far. To some extent, you cannot begin to grasp anything else about the world, about God, about anything else, until you come to understand, well, you, right? Who you are, what it means to be a human being. It's actually how the great reformer John Calvin begins his systematic theology. The title of section 1 of chapter 1 reads as follows: "Without knowledge of self, there is no knowledge of God." Right? Basically the first words in the Institutes of the Christian Religion. So perhaps technically we should have started there last Sunday instead of jumping straight into God, but well, what's done is done, right? What I want to do this morning is pull some of the best and wisest ideas, at least in theory, about what it means to be human, right? Look at those things, and then turn eventually to our reading Psalm 8. So keep a finger in there as a way to understand that even the best of those ideas, the best of human ideas about who we are, what we are going to be incomplete and insufficient. That is, there are truths about ourselves that we can observe for ourselves, like cans of tomatoes on kitchen countertops, right? There are truths about ourselves we can intuit for ourselves, right? Certain shoulds about ourselves that we can deduce on our own. But there are some truths that actually have to be revealed to us from outside of us, right? So let's dig in, right? Philosophy on humanity. Now, disclaimer time, I am not a philosophy scholar, not by any stretch, so this is all prefaced with as best as I can sort this stuff out. So, as best as I can sort this stuff out, there's a big break, a big shift that takes place, at least in Western philosophy, in how philosophy conceived about what it means to be human. That takes place around the time of the Enlightenment, about 400 years ago. So I want to start first with some basics of ancient philosophy. What did everybody think up to a certain point, right? And then look kind of how modernity throws a wrecking ball at the whole thing. But then look at how even the best of any of that ultimately falls short, right? So ancient philosophy. If you go back and take the two biggies of ancient philosophy, you know their names, Plato and Aristotle, right? In fact, in some ways, almost all philosophy seems to be a debate with those two guys, right? A lot of what they say about what it means to be human seems to boil down to three things, as best I can sort of sort it out. One, that we are meant to have meaning. Two, that we're meant to be social. And three, that our natures are unchanging, right? Now, that's actually not what modern philosophers argue, but I suspect deep down that's what many of us, even in the 20th century, many of us feel sort of instinctively, that there must be meaning, right? Relationships are important. I mean, on people's deathbeds, that's what people worry about and think about or rejoice in, relationships. And three, that there seems to be such a thing as human nature. Well, let's unpack those before we get to modern thought and its wrecking ball. One, we're meant for meaning. Plato once described humans as wingless animals with 2 feet and flat nails. Okay, that doesn't help us much. But fortunately, he also described us as beings in search of meaning. Beings in search of meaning. Likewise, Aristotle understood human beings as having a telos, right? A goal or an end that we're moving towards. And for him, it was the idea of the highest good, right? Humans are meant to have a good life, right? And he didn't mean by that an easy life, where all your worries are, it's worry-free and all that. What he meant is a good life is a virtuous life. And that's because a human being is a creature that can discern right from wrong, can discern just from unjust. And the thing is, that creates conflict and struggle in the soul, right? Which Plato saw. Plato saw the soul as the seat of both your reason and your passions and your desires, right? So that's where the struggle takes place for Plato. And so to be a human is to sort of navigate the mess of conflicting urges, your desires versus what's right and wrong, towards living a virtuous life, towards living a good life. And that's never something you can do on your own because of the second point, because we're meant to be in relationship. So you're living this virtuous life in relationship. Aristotle once defined human beings as political animals, right? And not politics as negotiating trade deals with China or something like that. It meant politics from the word polis, or city, right? You are who you are as a human being amongst other human beings, whether it's part of your family or you're part of the society with its laws and customs. And you achieve meaning, you move towards the telos of your goals, towards the telos of a good and virtuous life, in and only in a social context, right? Only in amongst others. Plato, for instance, felt we needed others. We are inherently not self-sufficient, he said. We crave companionship and friendship and human interaction. And my wife tells me that's true too. I wouldn't know it, but I'll take a word for it, right? But further, that idea of human beings as beings with souls, in search of meaningful lives, in social contexts, well, it's lastly, 3, their unchanging metaphysical nature. That's the unchanging human nature. That's who we are. We don't change. Sure, I personally might get a little better or worse here and there. I'm probably a little less uptight than I was 10 years ago. It's probably because of having kids. Also have a lot less hair than I had 10 years ago. That's probably also because of having kids. But that's just the picture of the arc of the virtuous life lived amongst others, right? Even as uneven as it might be in my case. But that's not what they mean. They mean that human nature doesn't change. If Plato were born today, sure, he'd be writing the Republic on a MacBook, right? He'd be an Apple fanboy, right? And sure, that would be a different experience. But the fundamental conflict, the human struggles to choose right in life and the world amidst the flood of emotions and desires in his soul, that wouldn't change. That doesn't change. That's who we are. Now let's step back. Let's step back and think about all that, because a lot of that's good, right? A lot of that would actually dovetail quite well with the Christian faith. Some of it wouldn't or is insufficient, and I want to get back to that. But first, I want to see where modern philosophy, right? That is modern thought since, well, around the time of that Descartes guy in the 1600s, where that has taken us, because it's basically inverted all that, right? Modern philosophy, right? A lot of what's been going on for the past 400 years or so, in thinking about what it means to be a human being, can be boiled down to 3 similar things, except completely opposite. 1, that there is not an intrinsic meaning to being a human being. 2, that it is the individual, not the society, that is actually all important in thinking. And 3, that human beings, human nature as it were, can change, right? So basically a complete 180 there. And to understand briefly why and how and all the rest, I want to start with the second item there, right? The focus on the individual, because that's what's at the center of it all. You can see it in Descartes' phrase, I think, therefore I am. The only thing he can know for certain is to begin with himself, right? To go what's going on here. It's all about him. It starts from there. The total subjective. You can see it in Adam Smith's 18th century economist, Adam Smith's analysis of early capitalism, Wealth of Nations, which focuses on individuals in the marketplace and their self-interested competition. You can see it in the emergence of what is called existentialism in the 19th century, which is concerned with the individual's awareness of his or her impending death, right? The anxiety over the fact that we exist but will one day die, right? Again, the individual. You can see it in the emergence of psychology, the study of the life of the individual human mind. And frankly, you can see that world of thought just become physically manifest in the world outside us, right? In the growing isolationism of society. The fact that people move around, they separate, they part very easily. Extended families are rarer or they're much smaller. That we are people increasingly disconnected from a sense of community unless you think Facebook and Instagram as community. Increasingly willing to divorce and to divide families. Because what matters is, well, the individual, my hopes, my dreams, my happiness. And that focus on the individual comes with another cost, right? The first item on that list of 3, the lack of meaning. The irony, of course, is we're actually a society obsessed with meaning, aren't we? With finding our meaning, with finding our calling, with finding our purpose in life. But the thing is, when you've shifted the focus of things from relationships and society to the individual, well, meaning kind of gets lost in the mix. If you look at some of the most important thinkers of the 1700s, one of the base assumptions that emerges, that starts to come out, is that human beings are driven by self-interest at the very least, and sometimes just by plain selfishness and greed. Adam Smith, that economist who wrote Wealth of Nations, this is what he wrote. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher or the brewer or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. Right? Or Thomas Hobbes, who wrote Leviathan. Right? He was a political theorist. He once wrote, "The condition of man is a condition of war of everyone against everyone." Well, there's an optimistic statement for you, right? Right? For him, that's why you need really strong sovereign governments to check everybody's natural impulses and keep some sense of order and peace going on. And then there's existentialism again. This 19th century Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard I mentioned earlier. This is what he wrote. If at the bottom of everything there were only a wild ferment, a power that twisting in dark passions produced everything great or inconsequential, if an unfathomable, insatiable emptiness lay hid beneath everything, what would life be but despair? Right? And Kierkegaard's a Christian. He doubts that dark vision he's describing, but he still recognizes it. He still sees it along with his zeitgeist, along with the world he lives in. He still sees it as a possibility. And I'm not going to go into it, but the 20th century sure as heck ain't any rosier, right? But you get the picture? Modernity brings with it the triumph of the individual, but it comes at the loss of meaning, a questioning of anything good about human beings, and a looming threat of despair and emptiness. And then there's one last thing. 3, human nature can change. Human nature is malleable, moldable. Now you might you might be tempted to say, well, that at least is some good news in what modernity thinks about the world. I mean, if human nature is already so awful to begin with, it's a darn good thing we can change it, right? But here's what modernity means by that. Human nature is essentially a social construct, right? There's no essential truth to it. There's no essential nature there. You can, in other words, intentionally recreate human nature at will. So in the 18th century, you have John Locke's idea of the tabula rasa, the blank slate, right? There's nothing really there. You can write on it, right? And that's reflected physically, historically, in the American Revolution and particularly in the French Revolution. They tried to make that happen, right? Let's rewrite who humans are, what they're like, how they interact with each other, particularly in the latter case using a guillotine, right? We're going to actually get rid of the ones who don't think this way, so we get more people who think this way. We can do that and we can change how everybody lives and thinks. Or take Karl Marx in the 19th century. He believed we're purely the products of our social conditioning. And so again, in theory, what communist governments have tried to do is to change society and education to create a different nature and therefore a different world. And instinctively, a part of us believes that's true too, right? We like to believe we have as a species the ability to change, maybe to become a little better over time. Maybe we have become, over the last few centuries with progress and all that, more humane, more just, maybe a little wiser and a little more peaceful. But I'm pretty sure 2 world wars in the 20th century and the fact that we are still quite possibly going to obliterate ourselves before humanity's story is over, I'm pretty sure those kinds of things suggest that we really haven't changed all that much from Thomas Hobbes' vision of everybody against everybody in war. We've just, frankly, gotten bigger guns, right? So what do we do? Because I think we're back to that first step John Calvin advised. That is, before we can understand anything at all, we've really got to understand ourselves. And philosophy, even modern philosophy, can give you some answers and it can point you to some truths and make some good observations here and there. But it's going to fall short at the end of the day. Modern philosophy, for what it's worth, it kind of gets human sinfulness, right? Not that it would use that term, right? It gets the idea that we're selfish, that we're greedy. It definitely gets us at our worst, right? At our most lost, at our most confused, at our most hopeless. But 1, that's not all there is to us. And 2, its solution to what's wrong with us is terrible. The idea that we can fix ourselves, it frankly just flies in the face of all that awfulness it supposedly knows about us, right? And frankly, the empirical evidence that it works is not there, right? Ancient philosophy, with its focus on unchanging human nature, that is all about a life intended to bring meaning in our relationships, in the places we live and work, purpose, out of the conflict in our hearts and our souls, right? Between the good we know and what we sometimes want that's not so good. Well, I think that's not bad. It's certainly close to the mark. Maybe the best one could do from merely observing things and making logical deductions. But it still falls short. And that's because all of this, the focus is all on us. The meaning that emerges in our lives, through our lives, our relationships with each other, our nature in and of ourselves. But what makes human beings special, and therefore where their meaning is, and where their most important relationship is, and what defines their nature, is not something intrinsic to us, not something within us. It's God. It's in our relationship with God. It's in our lives, but as gifts from God. And that truth can't necessarily be observed or deduced. It needs to be revealed. Something or someone has to show you that truth. And that's what Psalm 8 is getting at. So let's finally turn to Scripture. All right? Turning to Psalm 8. The psalm is framed by what's called an inclusio. If you look at the first and last line of the Psalms, they're the same. Right? Which means kind of the structure of the psalm should be imagined like a V, right? It's kind of all going down into things and then coming back out, okay? So let's start near the center and work our way out. Verse 3. When I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have set in place, what is man that you are mindful of him, and the son of man that you care for him? Now the first thing to notice is the comparison between the grand scale of the universe versus tiny little old us. If you ever spent time away from the city lights or even suburban lights, right, you know this feeling. I went camping late last summer, and I had forgotten just how ridiculously majestic the sky is and how terrifyingly infinite the number of stars are, how vast it looks, and how ridiculously small you feel in comparison to that cosmic expanse. Do you know the feeling? And yet, the psalmist speaks from a place of knowing somehow that humanity is, for some reason in God's will, the crowning achievement of all that creation. Not the stars, not the moon, not the sun, but little old us. In Genesis 1, humans are the last ones made, the last things made. They're the ones in all creation that are made in God's image. Right? And it's only once they are created that God can finally call the creation very good. He calls it good every step of the way. But once we come into existence, it's now very good. And the psalmist marvels at that here, that we are on God's mind, that he literally remembers us, that we are somehow important to him. For comparison's sake, the Greek playwright Sophocles, in his tragedy Antigone, writes, "Wonders are many, and none is more wonderful than man." Do you hear the difference between the two? Wonders are many, and none is more wonderful than man. For Sophocles, we are wonderful in and of ourselves. It's kind of no wonder it's a line from a tragedy, right? But for the psalmist, we are wonderful because God cares for us. But let's keep reading. Verse 5. Yet you have made him a little lower than the heavenly beings and crowned him with glory and honor. You have given him dominion over the works of your hands. You've put all things under his feet, all sheep and oxen. And it goes on from there using language from the Genesis 1 account of creation. The psalm is basically a commentary on Genesis 1 for what it's worth. So in a way, what the psalmist is describing here is what Sophocles, or really what any observer, might see as distinctive or intrinsically wonderful about humanity. This reality that somehow we do have dominion over the earth. The fact that we are physically and mentally built in such a way as to shape and control our environment like no other creature ever has. Our upright statures, our opposable thumbs, right? I love taunting my cats with this fact, right? I have dominion over you. Look at my opposable thumbs. They don't listen. But most of all, a highly developed brain, not that you would know it from that joke, right? Right? Capable of envisioning the future, planning for the future, inventing things for the future that will be helpful in the future, capable of highly complex communication and social interactions, even from a very young age. The psalmist would completely agree in part with Sophocles. A human being is a wonder. A human being is a glory in the creation. And the thing is, you want to hold there for one moment. You want to hold on to that thought there for a second as it is, because modernity would trash that thought. Modernity would say we're nothing special, or modernity might actually say worse. But what the Bible reveals is a humanity that is the crowning achievement of creation. We'll get to the cognitive whiplash that occurs when you read the paper or watch the news or just look in the mirror, right? We'll get there. But for now, let's stay here. Stay with the glory of what a human being is intended to be, the glory of what you are intended to be. But again, not in and of or by yourself, because the wonder and glory of a human being is all about God's doing. The glory and honor of humanity and dominion over the earth is really God's glory. Notice, for instance, that the human being is not the subject of these verses. It's God. You have made him, in verse 5. You have given him, in verse 6. Notice also the inclusio that frames, within verses 1 and 9, that frames the whole psalm. O Lord, O our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the world, in all the earth. The whole psalm is not even really about us as it is about us. It's really, really about God. He's the protagonist in the story of who we are. And knowing that about ourselves is critical. And it's not something philosophical that we can observe or deduce, but something God has to tell you, God has to reveal to you. So then how do things stack up against worldly philosophies? Do we have a meaning, a purpose to tell us? Well, we're intended to. We're intended to be stewards of God's good creation, faithful to him in the execution of those duties. Are we meant to have relationships? Absolutely, not just in families or societies with each other, but chiefly and primarily with God, who remembers us, who knows us, is mindful in us, and in whom, in those things, we find our very existence. Right? Our existence is because of that relationship. It's not I think, therefore I am. It's I am his, therefore I am. In our nature, well, nature, that's where it gets tricky, right? Because we are intended for all these good things, and yet something in our nature now fights against all that, right? Something in our nature now rebels against the one who has intended all those things for us. So what's the problem? Well, you'll probably be thankful, but I want to leave any in-depth discussion of sin, the fall, and all that for either RD or I to handle next week under the topic of salvation. But I do want to suggest briefly what the problem is from the perspective of Psalm 8 here. The biblical perspective on what it means to be a human being, as we've drawn it out of this passage, right, is that one finds one's meaning, one's source, right, one's worth, one's nature, and even if we can say one's wonder and glory from, in, and through God. Right? As Paul says in Romans 11, for from him and through him and to him are all things, to him be glory forever. Amen. The problem then is when we locate all those things, when we locate the source of our worth in ourselves, in humanity itself. Think about, for instance, the idea of having human rights. Think about human rights, right? Most everybody believes in human rights, right? Unless you're the dictator, and then in which case you don't really care that much for them. But generally, we all believe in human rights. Well, human rights is the ultimate statement of we have worth, every one of us. But without a God who reveals your worth, as he reveals your worth as worth to him, do we really have any human rights, right? Worth is about value to someone else. You're not worth in a vacuum. The U.S. Declaration of Independence outlines several what it calls truths about humans, right? Certain unalienable rights are all due to humans, all humans. Well, men at that time, but you stretch it out, right? Right? It calls these truths and these rights self-evident. Well, self-evident is really just a fancy word for unprovable, isn't it? Right? Because you can't prove that the universe, let alone your next door neighbor, actually owes you anything like rights or fairness or whatever. Not in and of ourselves. But if I really know my neighbor is a child of God, well, that changes things. If the all-powerful God of the universe values all of us, that changes things. But we've lost that understanding. And forget high-flying modern philosophy. We've lost that understanding in just the stuff that gets us through the day. Think about it. Where's your self-worth? What's your self-worth? What makes you think you are worthwhile or not worthwhile? What's the stuff that makes you believe you're awesome and on top of the world? Or just loved and wanted and cared for and important to someone? What's the stuff that makes you want to go crawl under a bed and cry? It all probably has something to do with career, family, children, marriage, friends, a good image, a good reputation, or the lack of some of those things. Or what about the worth of other human beings in your life? How do you evaluate? How do you decide who you spend time with and how much time you spend with them? Or how much money or resources you spend on other people or on other causes? That's the problem. The way Psalm 8 sees human beings as firstly remembered and loved by and important to God, that's not really how we typically see ourselves or others. But the good news for humanity is that God is so adamant, He is so certain about our worth to Him, so determined to be in that relationship with us, in that good relationship He intended in Genesis 1, that in Christ He becomes human with us, to fully reveal who we are truly, to fully reveal what a human being is meant to look like, and therein to rescue us from ourselves. Look at verse 4 again, but this time I'm going to read it as Hebrews 2 picks it up in the New Testament. What is man that you are mindful of him, or the Son of Man that you care for him? You made him for a little while lower than the angels. You have crowned him with glory and honor, putting everything in subjection under his feet. All right? The New Testament sees these words and knows them to be about Jesus Christ, the true human, the second Adam who reveals our true humanity. Because you see, in light of Jesus Christ, in light of his coming into the world and his dying on the cross and his being raised from the dead, right? The Son of God become the Son of Man. In light of him, these words in Psalm 8, they're not just about what we are intended to be, and they're not just about how we fail to understand ourselves and each other as God's great glory in his creation because of our worth to him. They're about Jesus Christ, who became one of us, who became a human being, who became the ideal human being, who literally embodied Psalm 8's philosophy, if you will, of humanity, who, because it was his purpose as a human, his purpose, his meaning as a human, took dominion of this fallen, broken creation, took responsibility for it, took true stewardship of it, and to fix us, laid down his life to save it. And who, because that is what a human being truly looks like, because of that, was crowned with the glory always intended for humanity. And the good news is, what he has done, what he does, because of his nature, changes our nature back to what it was always supposed to be, in the image of God, in the image of him, in the image of Jesus Christ. And so, human nature is not, as Plato thought, unchangeable. It is also not, as modernity imagines, infinitely and indeterminately malleable. It is, in the good news of the gospel, recoverable. That's the hope of the gospel in Psalm 8, that humanity in us that was always intended, a humanity in and for and through God, was lived out on this earth in the one man, Jesus Christ, so that all human beings might become in and for and through him the glorious humanity they were always intended to be. And that will certainly be perfectly true one day. But the more you live a life right now with a meaning and a worth not found in you, but in your worth to God revealed, to the person God remembers, and to the person he is recreating through Jesus in you even now. For from him and through him and to him are all things, and so to him be glory forever and ever.